Hi there, and thanks for joining. We're going to start in just a couple of minutes while people start to straggle in. Thanks for your patience. Okay, hello and welcome to Kenshu's Digital Marketing Quarterly Trends Report for the first quarter of 2019. My name is Chris Costello. I'll be your host for the next hour as we go through what happened in Q1 across digital marketing channels. We're in for a jam-packed hour. Once again, I'm the Senior Director of Marketing Research here at Kenshu. You can reach me at any of these places. You'll probably learn more about me than you care to if you follow me on Twitter, but that's up to you. Here's what mission control looks like here in Chicago, controlling the presentation, keeping an eye on Pinterest's share price now that they're a public company, and then last minute emails and Slack channels, messages over here so they don't pop up on my screen where you can see them. Photo by the boss, Margot Conrose. A bit about the webinar. You should all be in listen-only mode. You can submit questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will try to get to those at the end of the hour. If you have sound issues, you can get sound either through a phone connection or your computer mic and speakers. If one's not working, maybe try the other. And any issues that you have, you can hit us through the chat in the interface, or you can email Lily Rotter, who is sitting here next to me as we get going. So once again, a little bit about what this Quarterly Trends program is. We've been publishing infographics across key marketing trends for quite some time, going as far back as at least 2014, if not earlier. This is at least when I got involved. Kind of revved up to where we are today with what it looks like. It's now an interactive document on our website. We've also done a trends webinar that was mostly for financial analysts who kind of care about some of the key movers in our space. But after we've been sharing it over time, it became obvious that a more marketer-focused webinar really should be the main event. So that's where we are today. And this presentation will be accompanied by that quarterly infographic on the, similar to what you see on the right of the screen, and then a long form report that delves into the topics in some detail. What we're going to cover over the next hour, we're going to first talk about some higher level industry insights. We're going to get into the core market trends, talk a little bit about emerging channels. A new section this time is we're going to talk about some news stories that affect our industry and give you a quick rundown of what we think is going on there, the methodology, how we got what we got, and then hopefully some time for questions at the end. Now, it's important to remember as a marketer, before we had emojis and memes and GIFs, we had initialisms. And one of my favorites is your mileage may vary. And what that means is that you may zig when everyone else zags, and you may have a very good reason for doing that with your own program. So these trends are to provide context for your performance, but not judgment. It's not that you're doing things right or you're doing things wrong if you don't conform to what you see in some of these slides. It's just that you're different. You may have a reason for that. And with that in mind, let's take a look at what we saw happening across the industry. The big picture is that our key digital marketing channels continue the trend of overall growth after the holiday spike. We always see an increase in activity in Q4. That kind of pulls away a bit, but we still see consistent growth after you account for that seasonality. So what do we mean specifically? Well, social, search, and e-commerce ad spending all increased year over year on a same store basis. Newer properties like Pinterest and Apple search ads we'll talk about, and those are also gaining traction with marketers across the Kenju platform. For social, one of the key trends that we've seen is that as we see more video ads, we are seeing fewer clicks. And that is reflected in both the volume of clicks and then, as you see here, click-through rate. So the bars here are the share of impressions from video ads across social ads on Facebook and Instagram. And then the line is click-through rate over that time. So you see one's going up, one's going down. And well, why it should be somewhat intuitive why that may be the case. These video ads, as they've evolved on social and on Instagram, have been perhaps more effective at branding than old school static display ads. But as branding ads and as video ads, there's perhaps less direct interaction in the form of a click. So as these things become more prominent, we're going to see click-through rates drop as a result. And what that should tell you is not that, oh my God, people are not interacting with these ads or these ads are not effective. It's just that click-through rate may not be the best way to look at the efficiency and the effectiveness of these ads. It's kind of, helping motivate us to think better about how we're analyzing our programs. On the search side, mobile ads continue to be the big story there, the big growth engine. But one of the things that we've seen with mobile over time is that CPC of mobile search clicks has been declining over time, particularly as you add more inventory available on mobile search results pages, or even as you work to monetize your long tail of keywords. Those things tend to have, less competition, tend to have lower CPCs. So we see this trend going down over time with the purple line on this chart, but you see that click volume has more than made up for it, to the point where the overall growth of mobile in terms of spending has actually been faster than that of desktop search and of search overall. So this is also relevant to what we're seeing on the social side, where Instagram has lower CPMs, for example, but it's growing faster than everything else. So you can make up stable, robust overall growth numbers, even if your growth is coming from lower priced ad units. In terms of the e-commerce channel, many of you know that we're pretty active in this space today. On a same advertiser basis, we see e-commerce channel ads growing faster than both search and social. You see that number up in the low 80s year over year. And then, why is that? Well, we see advertisers across many, many vertical categories, but particular areas like CPG and consumer electronics, where this notion of ads within online retail gives an opportunity to reach customers very close to the point of purchase. It also affords certain advertisers an opportunity to directly reach their customers where they might have only been able to do branding online before, because they don't do their own e-commerce. So lots of reasons why we've seen this momentum, but it's been fairly consistent since we launched on the e-commerce channel last year. Pinterest, another big topic in the news with the IPO last week, and we've seen here volume increases year over year. This is not on a same advertiser basis. This is all advertisers on the platform. And we see that clicks and spend both increased at least double, spending a little bit more than that. And then clicks grew faster than impressions. You see impressions down around 80% year over year, which you can translate to higher levels of engagement as far as click-through rate goes with Pinterest ads. And Apple search ads, the new kid on the block for us. We've really gotten this going in Q3 of 2018. We've seen fairly robust growth across those 3 quarters. You can see here again, 80-something% growth compared to just 2 quarters ago. As with the e-commerce channel, it's a similar proposition for marketers in that you're getting in front of your customers literally while they're shopping, not while it's not about consideration. It's not about awareness. It's like, this is when people are in the store and looking for stuff. So the opportunity to get in front of those customers at that point is of strong value to marketers, and the investment reflects that. A couple of views we like to hit every quarter. How is mobile doing across channels? You see social in green and search in blue. They both continue to grow faster than overall. So you see 37% growth for social year over year, 24% for search. In terms of how much of the total that means for social, that's 84% of all social spending for ads has been on mobile devices. For search, it's half, which again, that was kind of a big step for the search industry to finally get to the point where mobile search ads comprised fully half of total ad spend. Product ads is another common area across the two. This is shopping campaigns on the search side, again in blue, and then dynamic ads for products, or DPA ads, for the social side in green. And you see both of those grew in the 30s year over year, so kind of similar rates. And you see that both of them, after that spike in Q4, obviously, because these are very retail focused and very e-commerce focused, you're going to come back, but you're going to land higher than you left in Q3. So we see that in both of those cases. So those are kind of the 10,000-foot level findings that we wanted to share. Now we're going to kind of get down into the nitty-gritty of the core channels, and we're going to start, as we typically do, with social. Again, when we talk about social, we are talking about primarily Facebook and Instagram. Pinterest is rolled up into here where applicable on the same store basis. Snapchat as well. But in terms of percentages, we are still talking mostly about Facebook and Instagram. From that perspective, we saw, again, growth across the board year over year in terms of impressions and overall spending. Overall spending 27% year over year for the first quarter. Clicks, on the other hand, trending down. We'll talk a little bit about why that is later. We already hinted at it up in the front. And we see decreases in clicks, decreases in spending over the holiday period. One thing to look at, if you look at the green bar on the right, is that if you account for the seasonality of Q4, you've got a fairly consistent growth trend there for spending on the social platform. Click-through rate and CPM pricing. Click-through rate, we already showed you in that early teaser, has been declining over time, 17% down quarter over quarter, 37% down year over year. And then CPM we see that spike in Q4, and then it kind of comes down to where it was a little bit lower than Q3 actually, but 6% up year over year. Last quarter when we did this, some folks wanted to see how this broke out monthly. So we have that here. You can see the big spike on spending came in November when we hit Thanksgiving and Black Friday and Cyber Monday and all that good stuff. And then again in January, you see this spike of impressions. And typically what we've heard anecdotally and what we can see in the data is that non-retail advertisers kind of get back in the game on social after the return of all the oxygen in the room. They got sucked up by e-commerce over the holiday season. So in summary, what do we see happening? Well, overall, that top line number, 27% growth compared to Q1 of 2018. The faster growth is in some of those key segments we've been tracking: Instagram, video ads, mobile ads. That's really where the impetus for the growth is coming from. But at the same time, we're seeing growth in these more passive ad units from a direct engagement point of view. And that's video, that's stories, and those may be factors in that overall decline of clicks and click-through rate. And to see what that looks like, I'm actually going to throw some stats at you. If we take each month, the 15 months between Jan 2018 and March 2019, and we plot the share of social impressions from video and the click-through rate. This is essentially the same as that chart we saw earlier in a slightly different form. You see a bit of a downward trend. In statistical terms, when you look at that R-squared number, that 0.53, that roughly means that the share of impressions from video ads explains about half of the variation in click-through rate. So this does imply that video share may be a factor in the overall decline, along with perhaps some other things. But keep in mind that correlation is not causation. These things could be varying together for the same root cause rather than one affecting the other. But it does show that there is some association between the relative volume of highly visual, more passive ads and then the resulting overall social click-through rate. One of the other things we're seeing is this increasing diversity in social ad inventory. If you're a social marketer, you know that life has gotten probably more complicated rather than more simple. And one of the reasons for that is just this diversity in ad types. For example, carousel product ads specifically. You know, there are other carousel, but if we focus on product ads, and video ads were 49% of spending a year ago, they're now up to 59%. You see that the purple part of the bar, the other category, growing fast as well. And a lot of this is as those kind of plain old page post link ads kind of lose their share. That used to be a huge part of ads within the news feed. But now as you get more and more of these specialized ad types, that's less and less of the case. And that's more complicated for all of us as marketers. And that's kind of why we look at these trends to see what this all means. So what does this all mean? If we break some of these things out by segment, a little intro about how to read these bubble charts. Along the x-axis, you have the CPM pricing. Along the y-axis, you have click-through rate. The size of the bubble is the total spend for that particular bubble. And these bubbles are not mutually exclusive. And for example, dynamic ads for products and carousel ads are frequently the same thing. There's overlap between Instagram and a bunch of these other categories as well. But what we look for as we step through the quarters is most of the relationships kind of stay together. Dynamic ads for products / carousel are both cheaper on a CPM basis and more engaging from a click-through rate perspective than the whole Instagram, generally lower CTR and lower CPM as a whole, video more expensive, desktop feed more expensive still. And you also see, as you go from Q3 to Q4, everything kind of move out to the right as we hit seasonality and then track back a bit in Q1 of 2019. But it's just kind of the overall shape of the constellations, if you will, that are kind of the thing to take from this and how to read it. Let's drill in a little bit on a couple of those key elements. Instagram is a big topic of conversation. We saw that Instagram continues to grow faster than overall social. In fact, 44% compared to Q1 of last year. These numbers are getting lower than we've said like last quarter. I think we were around like 100% growth, or maybe even more than that for Instagram. But we've essentially lapped that first period where Instagram really started getting going. So those numbers are going to still grow faster than everything else, but they're not going to be quite as eye-popping as they've been in the past because of what the kids call the comps. You know, the number we're comparing to is going to be higher than it was perhaps a year and a half ago. And Instagram Stories is the blue tip of these columns. And it's still very new, it's still very small, it's still very volatile. As a share of total, it actually declined a bit for us in Q1 across this cohort of advertisers. Some of that is that, you know, advertisers may have been pulling out all the stops in Q4. And, you know, if there are eyeballs on Instagram and Instagram Stories, the dollars were going to flow there. And so as we come back out of that intense period, that kind of pulled back a little bit. And again, we have there. This is a small segment, and so if somebody big does something big, you'll see that reflected in these numbers. Now, we looked at this on the bubble chart. What I want to do is kind of trace those bubbles for Instagram to see how it moved across CPM and CTR and size over time. If you do that and include size, it's a little bit of a jumbled mess. You can see Q1 2018 kind of as the furthest to the left. It moves off to the right and up and then back. If you then just look at the motion through CPM and click-through rate there on the right, you can see that while we talked about how it increased 44% year over year, declined 24% quarter over quarter, CPM has not really shown much of a trend. It's up, it's down, it's up, it's down. Click-through rate has mostly stayed within that narrow band. So not a lot of real fundamental change to how Instagram behaves in this regard. Social video is another thing that we like to look at. Here we have the total indexed spending volume in the green bars, and then we have the share of total from spending on video. And the thing to look at here is we only see this 2% decline quarter over quarter from Q4 to Q1, whereas we saw bigger numbers across the whole of social. And that shouldn't necessarily come as a surprise, because as we said, there are a lot of advertisers who get back into the game in Q1 who sat out in Q4. They may be heavier on video. E-commerce also, while they do definitely use video ads across social media, are not as, they have to share that spend with other ad types like product ads. So their exposure to that ad type is maybe a little lower. So there's less volatility, less seasonality here on the video side. And at that, the blue line on top, at 44% of Q1 spending, those video ads were more than both single link or multi-link or carousel posts. So the biggest share of spending in terms of Facebook post type, which is the way that they delineate these things. So if we take social video and do our little trace the bubbles trick, you can see it starts up a little bit higher on the left there, and then works down and over. If we look at how that progresses, we can see, again, a bit of a yo-yoing on CPM in general and an overall definite downward trend in terms of click-through rate. But as I mentioned earlier, click-through rate maybe not the best way to look at video ads on social. But, it's historically, we've always known click-through rate is the thing that we measure because we can, not necessarily because we should. And that is fairly pervasive even today, and even when I'm readily admitting that there might be better options. Product ads, if we look at spending and impressions, particularly and then also pricing in blue here. You see that big spike, obviously, in impressions, or in spending rather, on this ad type, while impressions have kind of decreased somewhat. You also see that with the exception of that spike in CPM, it's a fairly linear price growth over time. One of the reasons we may be seeing this impression drop, because these are very valuable ads for retailers and e-commerce advertisers in particular, is when you look at an increase in price and a decrease in impressions, one of the things that could make that happen would be more advanced, more precise targeting. When you think of audience targeting, the narrower you get, the more expensive it is. It's the tighter focus you have, it's going to have upward pressure on prices, but it's also going to have downward pressure on impressions, because you are targeting this narrower audience. And that may be one of the underlying factors here as to why we see those trends in opposite directions like that. If we once again trace our bubbles, this is a little more straightforward. You see things kind of move from left to right, except for Q1, which kind of comes back after that pricing spike on CPM, which is what you would expect given the seasonality. Another view we want to give you of Q1 just on its own now is just how a bunch of different key verticals kind of shake out in terms of CPM and click-through rate. So you see here, in particular, auto had some high CPMs, travel had the lower end of that scale. E-commerce, kind of further up, but then when you think about it, e-commerce has a higher proportion of those dynamic product ads, of carousel ads. We've shown already that those have higher click-through rates, so it stands to reason that as a segment, we would have higher click-through rates for that group. Now, for the CPM piece, one of the things we already looked at video and how that affects click-through rates and how CPMs, and how video has a generally higher CPM than overall social. And looking at the relative use of video ads helps explain some of those differences by vertical. Here you see automotive has both a higher share of video ad impressions and a higher price for those impressions. E-commerce is the opposite. So that kind of explains where they shake out from left to right on the chart that I showed you previously. Travel, on the other hand, is, you know, kind of a cautionary tale of be careful if you slice your data very thin. You know, in aggregate, you may have one big advertiser that's doing something a certain way. They may be going for a broad strategy of coverage at low CPMs, and that's in fact what we saw with why travel was where it was on that chart. So in summary, for you, the marketer, what should you be taking away from what we saw across social? Well, as always, changes in CPM or CTR could go back to your mix of placements, your mix of ad formats, and or your industry, which may have, and I apologize for the sirens in the background, we are in downtown Chicago, there's a lot happening. And industry could have systematic biases around placement, around ad format, where, you know, one industry may be more invested in video ads, which have higher CPMs. Therefore, if you are in that industry, you're going to see that as well. And then as this ecosystem continues to evolve and continues to get more complicated, there are tools to help you cut through all of this complexity. Kenshu bid multipliers is something that we have here that will help you. Facebook placement optimization. All these things are evolving alongside with this complexity to help you manage it at scale. You can even kind of layer these things on top of each other and come up with more advanced strategies to approach, you know, when should I be on Instagram? When should I be video versus static image? When should I be this, that, the other thing? And this goes back to what we talked about with click-through rate. We may need to look as marketers beyond traditional metrics like click-through rate to assess the impact of branding-focused social ad units, cross-channel impact of some of these things. There are a lot of different levers now, and understanding how they interact is going to be very important to the future of understanding what's working and what's not. That concludes the social part of our program. We're now going to jump in and talk a bit about search. On the search side, again, typical seasonal effect receding. We see a decline in impressions, clicks, and spending across the board. We see year-over-year increases in all of those metrics, more for impressions than clicks than spending, which hit 11% growth over what we saw last year on a same advertiser basis. Click-through rate and CPC continue to be fairly steady within a small band of variance. You see click-through rate up a bit quarter over quarter, down a bit year over year. You see CPCs, that downward trend, interrupted slightly by seasonality. We talked a little bit about the mobile impact of that. We'll see some other factors in the next couple of slides. That monthly view, you see the light green bar for November and December. You see impressions really spike there. Obviously, in search world, more impressions means more searches or searches on more things, both of which spike during the holidays for obvious reasons. So, to give you the executive summary up front on this, seasonal spending boost starts to pull back, but we saw that overall paid search spending up 11% over Q1 of 2018, and that also was a modest increase over those pre-holiday levels in Q3. And, this is almost an evergreen summary point every quarter, and that is that mobile search continues to grow more than twice as fast as the overall average across both keywords and shopping campaigns. It's still the big story in terms of growth within search world. Looking at our overall bubble chart with the size of the bubbles, once again, these are not mutually exclusive. It's a little more obvious here because you have smartphone shopping, desktop shopping, and overall shopping. I would point your attention to that bottom left corner because that's where a lot of the movement's going to happen here as we step through from Q1 to Q2. Everything just kind of gets bigger and stays put. Little bit of side-to-side motion, but still just kind of growing. Those shopping bubbles really kind of take off from Q3 to Q4, from left to right, and then everything pulls back a bit. And you see the general, other qualities of the constellation here, where smartphone keywords have, relatively high click-through rates. Desktop keywords have relatively high CPCs. Shopping ads still tend to be lower priced and lower CTR than the rest of search. A lot of that is when you get into shopping ads, you are getting a more targeted, more specific, more unique offering. So there's typically less competition on those types of keywords, particularly as you get further and further down the long tail. There also may be, less shoppers out there for them, but you want to be there when they get there. So, a low click-through rate may not be that big of a deal because you are at a lower CPC point. And if you do get the conversion on the back end, you're going to justify that spending at the end of the day. If we break down CPC just by device, you can see that the holiday price premiums were seeded across all devices. Primarily, this is driven by the shopping campaign piece and not the keyword piece. And then desktop search ads, the line on top, is continuing to trend slightly upwards as those become more valuable, relatively speaking, even if they are a smaller share of the overall total. A bit more of a focus on mobile. We like showing the share of the primary volume metrics for smartphone paid search ads. It's been fairly consistent on the impression and click side. We're up just over 2/3 on both of them, have been for a few quarters now. And then on the spending side, we've been at or near 50% of spending for mobile paid search ads for 3 quarters. We do live in a mobile search world now, and that's reflected by a lot of the behavioral patterns and how we as marketers are trying to reach those customers. We take our mobile search and once again trace our bubbles. We start up in the top right, we end up kind of midway on the left there, and here you can see some of that is, you see the CPC staying flat from Q3 to Q4 and then dropping a little bit into Q1. You see a little bit of a rebound of overall click-through rate in Q1 as we kind of return to normal operating parameters versus the holidays. And if we do the same for desktop keywords, we saw that way out on the right, that was kind of behaving pretty interestingly. What's interesting about desktop keywords is that the relative size of the spending bubble hasn't really changed. It hasn't grown, it hasn't really shrunk from Q1 2018 to Q1 2019. This is one of those cases where the bubble chart that shows the size actually does convey most of what's going on. But if once again we strip out that and just look at the motion, you see that bit of a spike on CPCs in Q4 that kind of pulls out, but it's a pretty stable trend in terms of what we're seeing for desktop keywords. I want to give that industry view again. You see the total there towards the bottom left. E-commerce does factor in fairly heavily here, so that's kind of the pulling it gravitationally in that direction. But you do, and e-commerce is lower in CPC, lower in click-through rate. But as we discussed on the social side, there are a lot of mobile shopping ads in this segment, and those tend to be lower cost and lower click-through rate. Travel and finance, on the other hand, both have very high levels of engagement with paid search ads. And it would be cruel of me just to leave it at that and say that's just the way it is. Let's look at why that is. And it's a dimension that we haven't really talked about previously, but it's kind of interesting to the overall thing, and that is brand keywords. If we take kind of the dumbest possible way of defining what brand keywords mean, just look at campaign names and look for the word brand. We'll negative match a couple of things in there so we don't include the phrase non-branded. But even using this rudimentary definition, we see the role that brand versus non-brand has in that click-through rate, that high click-through rate for finance and travel, in that we see much higher impression share, particularly for finance, but also for travel relative to total and relative to e-commerce in terms of what the share of brand terms is, and that then subsequently drives up that overall click-through rate. So that helps explain why those two verticals live where they do on that particular visualization of the data. So in summary, for those of you search marketers on the call here today, your base level of consumer engagement for your paid search program may very well depend on your industry vertical for some systematic reasons. And a lot of that is just how the mix versus brand, the mix of brand versus non-brand tends to vary by industry, at least across our data set. Again, I go back to that first slide. Your mileage may vary. But if you do see drastically higher click-through rate or drastically lower click-through rate than some of the numbers we're looking at, your mix of brand versus non-brand could be one very important dimension to consider. And that's in addition to other things we've already talked about, mobile versus desktop, shopping versus keywords. These also exert influence over your overall CPC or your overall click-through rate. But again, things get more complicated, a lot more mobile scenarios, a lot more mobile moments we're trying to target, ways that you can help that. There are tools that are being developed both by us and by publishers. We have smart tags. Google has smart bidding. These are two examples of machine learning-based tools that can help you navigate this complexity, navigate these segments, and do this at scale, which is really important because when you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of keywords, you're not going to go in and modify them. We've been past that for a long time, but as the tools get better, so goes the campaign management. And then on the search side, there's also audience targeting. We've always had strong intent signals on paid search, but then there's also more advanced campaign management. Kenshoo has ways that you can hook in audiences from social even. So I encourage you to look at other ways that you can layer that in to help supercharge your search programs. That's what we've got for search. Next, I'd like to talk about some of the emerging channels. We talked about them up top, so I'm just going to give you a little more context there. Once again, I want to look at the e-commerce numbers. We saw that year-over-year growth on the same advertiser basis, 83%. And we only saw a small decline, only 6% down over Q4, and a bigger jump, 11% over pre-holiday levels than perhaps we saw in some of the other channels. And one of the things that we've seen over time with e-commerce advertising is that where search or social, when you get in the holidays, you'll see changes in volume and changes in pricing. With e-commerce, it's a bit more just changes of volume. The pricing actually stays fairly resistant to seasonal influences. And so as a result, you're going to see perhaps less dramatic jumps when you do hit a period of intense volume because you don't get that force multiplier of pricing, which, in turn for an advertiser is fantastic. It helps you kind of game out a little more accurately. You only have one thing to worry about when you're thinking about how things are going to scale up during one of these periods of more intense action. Pinterest, we looked at the year-over-year numbers in isolation before. This is how it kind of shakes out over time. We did see a bit of more of a drop-off in Q1 compared to Q3, but if you remember from last time, or I'll refresh your memory if you weren't here last time, we actually saw a bit of an earlier seasonal pattern with Pinterest. When you think of its role in kind of both medium and long-term planning, we saw more activity start to bubble up in Q3, even well in advance of Black Friday and Cyber Monday and all of that good stuff. So it kind of makes sense that with Q3 being a little more inflated than we saw in other channels, then that the relationship between Q3 and Q1 might also be a little bit different. In terms of pricing, Pinterest still lives in this space kind of between search and social. As such, it's, you don't necessarily know whether CPM or CPC is the best reflection of the price of a Pinterest ad, so we look at both. The one thing that's most interesting here is that with what we saw in Q3 with that increased interest in advance of the holidays, we see that increase in CPC pricing. So, perhaps the clicks are getting more active in Q3. Your costs on an impression basis haven't quite started to change yet. But then all of that kind of pulls back a bit going into Q1 of this year. And then Apple search ads. Normally, the context that we show is pretty much the market, and we try to keep it as Kenshu neutral as possible. But just to kind of show how much traction we're seeing for Apple search, if we look across the Kenshu apps platform, you may have known it previously as AdQuant. It is now known as Kenshu apps. It is where we have a very app advertiser focus rather than just broader social media ads. But within that platform, since launching in Q3, spending for Apple search ads is already $1 out of $3 on this platform. So there have been a couple big advertisers who are very interested in it, obviously, but this is just another way to show that there's been a lot of momentum to Apple search ads as a advertising platform for digital marketers. So what can we take from this overall? Well, you know, I talked about it way up at the top, but it's very much worth repeating here that both e-commerce and Apple search ads provide marketers with the opportunity to get closer to those shoppers as they're shopping, close to the point of purchase. We've made the analogy with Amazon in particular about it. It's similar to end caps or product placement within a physical store. You know, you're hitting people when they are clearly very likely to purchase something because they're physically, or in this case, virtually now in your store. And that provides a unique opportunity for some advertisers that may not have been doing direct response before. When you think about CPG and branded manufacturers who may not have been selling on their own, this gives them a way to get into direct response advertising. We've heard this anecdotally time and time again that you know, it's like, and it's a whole new world for a lot of these companies and these brands. And then Pinterest exists in that unique space between search and social. It is a discovery platform, so it's similar to search. It is a sharing platform, so it is social. So it's, you know, I'm not going to say it's a unicorn that has clearly different meaning with regard to last week's IPO, but you know, it does kind of live in a strange space in the funnel that marketers find valuable across a couple different points of the journey. Which, you know, and there you see it written out. I always forget what my builds are in these slides. So that's kind of the view of emerging channels. I want to take a little bit of time now to talk about some of the stories we've seen in the news and what they may mean for marketers. And then we'll hopefully have some time for questions, and hopefully we have some questions at the end. Instagram checkout. A lot of people talking about this when it was announced a few weeks ago. What does it mean? Why does it matter? This is the ability to buy things on Instagram without actually leaving Instagram via integration of shoppable posts. And that's going to be important. I'll tell you why in a second. But what this potentially does is it keeps customers in the funnel who might have fallen out of the funnel because they don't want to leave the app. If you're going through your Instagram feed, you see something that you might want to buy, but you know that clicking on it will take you out of there and but you really want to keep going through your feed. You might say, oh, okay, I'll get to that later, but then you never do. This is a way of keeping those people in on your radar, or you on their radar rather. And then it also offers a more direct attribution of sales to Instagram as a channel. Now, I am a huge fan of considering attribution as a much wider lens, looking at Instagram conversion rates or ROI in isolation can be somewhat distorted, but at the same time, we know everyone does it. And we know that as you make a case for Instagram as an advertising channel, if you can point to direct conversions that come off of it, that's only going to bolster that case. So this helps kind of reduce that friction as well. But to keep in mind, this is currently a limited rollout to a small number of brands and only in shoppable posts and not ads. So as it's rolled out to more advertisers and also across more as it expands into ad units, we expect that this could affect spending levels across Instagram as well. You could start to see more efficacy there. You could start to see the algorithm start to move things over there as well. Google considering some targeting restrictions on from third parties. This is similar to things that we've heard from Apple with their ITP. What does it mean? Why does it matter? Well, we've been kind of moving towards a post-cookie world since Apple started talking about ITP. So on the one hand, from a technology point of view, everyone's working to come up with a new and better way of looking at the world where we can still do the things we want to do without infringing on personal data and privacy in the ways that these mechanisms are built to counteract. But the other thing that this is going to make us think about is how we are measuring our campaigns across multiple publishers, across multiple devices. I am a veteran of multi-touch attribution, and I know the appeal of multi-touch attribution, but you have to be able to see all the touches. And even in a best case scenario, you didn't always see all the touches. So the fact that some of those touches may be a little less visible is kind of forcing us to rethink how we're talking about looking across these different areas. And you'll see incrementality is a kind of a new discipline that's coming up on the measurement side versus attribution. And it's taking more of a classic test and control environment and applying it in more rigorous ways across online marketing than the old lift study where you had like a PSA display showing instead of an ad. So, keep an eye on this as ways to advance your measurement platforms and your measurement programs going forward. And the other thing about this is it may have less of an impact on walled gardens. There's a lot of data within Google, within Facebook, within Amazon, within Bing. And so you'll probably see less impact there than you will in areas where you're moving from one site to the next or from one modality to the next. Google also showing some increased focus on the search engine's results page for Google Assistant. More detailed results, smart answers, you're hearing them called. Why does that matter? Well, we know that voice search is a bigger and bigger deal as it becomes more sophisticated. And as goes the results page for voice searches, so goes the ad inventory. There's another article similar to this that explicitly talking about how ads are coming to Google Assistant. And whether that is a voice input, text output, or other means, this is the first of those. The second of those, we'll see about voice to voice as the technology develops. Local business profiles on Instagram. This is something that we saw in the news last month. And what does this mean? Well, it's better hooks between Instagram and local businesses. If you see something from a local shop on Instagram that you like, you can now click on the profile, you can see where they are, you can see their hours. That can only help facilitate online to offline behavior for Instagram. It opens up possibilities for small and local businesses in particular with that as an advertising platform. Google adding third-party site links. This is a quiet but important thing that we've seen recently, and that is that within the site link extensions for Google paid search ads, you can now link to a couple of whitelisted third parties, particularly Amazon and Best Buy. And this kind of opens up a lot of possibilities. We talked earlier about traditional like CPG brands and brands that don't sell them on their own and why Amazon and e-commerce are such a big deal for them. Well, this kind of helps facilitate more of that because it helps, we talk about, you'll see stats about how, 55, 60% of product ad searches begin on Amazon. There's still the other 40%, the other 45%, and you want to make sure that you can get them to where people can buy your stuff. And if people are buying your stuff on Amazon and Best Buy, you want them to go there. So it opens up the possibility for advertisers to do more than just branding online, and branding for paid search has never been a strong use case. So adding direct response is kind of a big deal. Finally, optimizing Pinterest for conversions. This just helps empower marketers to do more with the channel. I think we've seen a lot of development. Any emerging advertising channel, you're going to see a lot of enhancements over time, ways that you can tune your offering better for marketers. This is one of those things. It allows you to see and act upon the impact of Pinterest across the full funnel. If you're seeing certain things that are driving more conversions, you can start to optimize towards those units and those audiences. And that's the kind of optimization we as marketers like, the control that we like to have over our programs. So a bit about the data. We are across all of these different publishers you see on the top. 15 months of data. It's over 500 billion impressions, over probably 6 billion in total. We do index our volume numbers because we don't want to tell you specifically how much money is going through the platform. And then we also do adjust for currency fluctuations. So that's that. From when we talk about same store or same advertiser, what we're talking about is that the Kenshu account must have 15 consecutive months above a certain threshold to be included. And I do reserve the right to remove additional outliers. Like I said, sometimes a big fish will do something kind of counterintuitive, and that can muck with trends. It's more of an indication of that one big fish than the overall. So sometimes I'll take those out. Some channels, not e-commerce and Pinterest, but Apple Search and Pinterest in particular, may be shown on an unfiltered basis, because for a newer platform, there's a lot more dynamics. There's a lot more, you may catch the velocity of spending coming onto the channel if you were to look on a same advertiser basis. So with that, I'm going to check the list of questions. And to set us up, this is what would happen if you had a Reddit Ask Me Anything with our good friend Bran Stark. Someone has pointed out to me after I put this that he cannot see what will be. He can only see what was and what is. If he saw what will be, then he would know if Dragonfire could kill the Night King. Start off with an easy one. Would you share the deck or recorded video at the end of the session? Yes, we will. Next question is, you will get a follow-up email that will have all the links to stuff that you need to know, including some exciting news about some events we've got coming up at Kenshu, perhaps as well. Any detail RE spend on Snapchat? Not yet, but I'm getting better visibility into the Snapchat spending, particularly on the Kenshu apps platform. App installs has pretty consistently been one of the stronger use cases for Snap as a platform. I'm excited to actually be able to see it with a little more granularity. So hopefully in future reports, we will talk about that. Question, how are e-commerce channel ads different from Google Shopping ads or Facebook dynamic product ads? The distinction that we make here is that e-commerce channel ads are literally in the online store. Amazon has been calling these online retail ads. They're in a retail establishment. It's just an online one. Google Shopping, you're still a few clicks away from purchasing. Facebook dynamic product ads, same deal. Both of those are trying to reduce the friction to get to that final purchase, but you do not have the immediacy that you have when you are in an online store shopping and you see ads that are related to either the thing that you're looking at or the thing that you looked for. You can kind of divide the conversion funnel, the traditional conversion funnel. Search kind of sits kind of right in the middle, in the medium term towards the short term. Social is kind of in the medium term out to the long term. But e-commerce channel ads are really, really down at the conversion end of that funnel. They're very, very close to it. And you have a very, I don't want to say suggestible. That makes consumers sound like sheep. They're not sheep. They're individuals with free will. Brand knowing what's happening notwithstanding. But getting that close to them when they're in shopping mode is very, very lucrative or just attractive in terms of overall purchase intent. Is Amazon the majority of e-commerce sites? Yes, it is. Which then goes to the next question. When we talk about e-commerce, we are primarily talking about, at this particular point, we are talking about Amazon. I actually wouldn't mind putting Apple search ads in that same bucket with them, but I have to argue with some people here at Kenshu to make that happen. Where is social in its growth curve compared to where social is, or to where search is now? Social is still growing faster, clearly, than search is. So, there's a good 5-6 years of maturity, probably longer than that if I really thought about it on the search side. So, we do expect A, faster growth, and then B, some deceleration into kind of a mature mode. When you think of a curve and the slope of the line, if you're growing fast, you're starting to grow less fast as time goes on, just because you're starting to hit a point of diminishing returns, whether that's ad load, whether that's just available inventory, period, which would be the same as ad load. So, the markets are talking about deceleration for Facebook, where we saw some at the end of the year. They expect a little bit in Q1. The big question for me is if we are seeing a new normal of slow deceleration to a new general growth rate, or if it was just a bit of a 3 to 6 month correction, and now this 27% range is the new normal. I'm not quite sure. There are arguments to be made on either side of that equation. We'll see what happens when you join us again for the Q2 results. Let's see. For increased passive ad units, what metrics do you think will be increasingly more important? That is a great question. That is probably more time than we have to answer that, just because it's very complicated. We talked about kind of the next generation of what old lift studies were, and that is what we're talking about with incrementality. If you measure your inputs on video ads, what do your outputs look like across all channels? What does it even look like for offline sales? And you're seeing an increasingly sophisticated tool set to start to do that. One of the other things we've often seen with video ads in particular is that you use them to help populate audiences for later targeting. So if you were to put everyone who completed a video view into an audience that you then retarget to with certain messaging, the trick is that you have to include all of that together when you're looking at your return metrics, and whether that be ROI, ROAS, conversion rate, cost per acquisition, you need to include both levers to make it work. So the trick is A, perhaps look at different things, B, look more broadly than just the one thing that we're talking about, unless you're doing sophisticated fractional attribution, but we talked about how that's becoming increasingly problematic. There's a question about, do we have CPC or click-through rate trends on the technology industry? I think in aggregate that might be a little too thin. If you are a Kenshu client, you can reach out to your account manager. They may be able to help you there. Is there any way to gather sales attribution from sales on Amazon when sending ads from Google to Amazon? Now, I do believe this is something that Amazon attribution is working on, so there should be some hooks around that going forward. I don't have specifics around it. So I think those are all. If you had a question that I did not answer, if you thought of a question after the fact, feel free to reach out, either respond to the follow-up emails, or you had my contact information up front. You can hit me up there. We also have case studies in a lot of instances for newer ad types, newer post types, newer channels. The individual stories will come in quicker than the aggregate data. So I recommend that you look there. These are some of the ones that we have posted recently, vaguely color-coded, where green is search, purple is e-commerce, blue is social, and red is Pinterest. I also would point you to the infographic that we will be, that should be on the site today if it is not there already. We have a long form report that will be posted today if it is not already. And we're also really upping the content on the Kenshu blog. There's a lot of stuff going on there. I definitely recommend that you check it out. That's all the time we have today. So until next quarter, when we talk about what's happening right now as we speak across these channels, I thank you for your time. I thank you for attention. We will be in touch. And I hope you got, if you got half as much out of this as I got out of it, then I got twice as much out of it than you. On that note, thank you very much. Good night.